know that in November of 2018, a little more than a year ago, President Macron from France invited something like 50 heads of state to the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. This was the Paris Peace Forum. And Maya, Arthur, and myself were invited to attend, and it was my great pleasure to give a little talk in the forum, highlighting some of the key points that come out of the research that we have done on global governance issues. And literally a few days before the forum, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of several hundred scientists that work under the sponsorship of the United Nations, issued its latest report on basically the current state of the world from the perspective of climate change and what's happening on the environment. And it was really a very, very sort of gripping document. These scientists have tended to be very conservative and very cautious over the last several decades in the assessments that they have made of what's happening on the climate change side. But on this occasion, I think they decided that they would going to be a little bit more persuasive and raise perhaps the level of concern, somewhat more. And so I just wanted to share with you the following sentence that comes out of that report. He said that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And then for the first time, they actually put a timeline, and they say that we need to do these things, literally over the next decade or so. They think that 2030 will be a kind of a critical threshold. And then, of course, they said that, unfortunately, we are well on our way to breach this 1.5 degree threshold, and in the absence of, very concerted actions on the part of governments, the business community, civil society, everybody, we are going to enter into uncharted territory, because in fact the scientists have demonstrated that there hasn't been an increase of 2 degrees temperature on average in the last 1 million years. I understand that now, since then, the debate has broadened, and so some scientists are saying, no, it's not 1 million years, it's actually 3 million years. All right, well, take your pick. Somewhere between 1 and 3 million years, we are entering into uncharted territory, and therefore we may see things that we have not seen before in terms of sea level rise, in terms of extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, and other kinds of unforeseen consequences associated with, global warming and associated environmental shocks. Now, this is certainly not by any means the only kind of catastrophic risk that we're currently facing as a human family. There are other potential sources of instability in the world, and I just like to mention, a couple of them in passing. Nuclear proliferation as a potential source of risk has been with us since essentially 1945. The end of the Second World War, and the explosion of nuclear weapons over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Shortly after 1945, we enter into an arms race, and today we have something like 9,000 nuclear weapons. We have at least 9 declared countries that have access to these weapons, which, in the middle of a conflict can turn, as was once put by Jonathan Schell, a very prominent thinker on these issues. He said that, the use of these weapons could easily turn the planet into a republic of insects and grass, right? And so that remains as a risk. And there is a group of atomic scientists who have this clock. You've heard about the clock, right? And it used to be stuck at 2 minutes before midnight for a long, long time, right? But recently, about a month or two ago, they have moved the handles further, and I think we are like 100 seconds before midnight, right? You might think that this is over-dramatizing things, but they are concerned. They are concerned about what they perceive to be a kind of a new arms race, between the global powers, and I think for that reason they were moved to shift the handles, a little bit closer to midnight. So that is another potential source of risk. Of course, it's an existential risk because Since 1945, the foreign policy experts have been saying that, for the first time, a conflict would become truly global in nature and, hugely destabilizing with great costs in terms of, human fatalities, the global economy, the system which sustains our life on the planet. I'm an economist, and I think that on the economic side, we also have some vulnerabilities and sources of risk. Income inequality is no longer just an economic problem. We economists for many decades tended to see income inequality as a kind of a problem of resource allocation, that somehow the economic system is not delivering opportunities to everybody in an equitable way. But now, for the first time, you see more and more economists and international organizations highlighting the political and social consequences associated to income inequality. In other words, it has stopped being just a problem of resource allocation, and now it has a very large political dimension as well. And more people are arguing that if income inequality is allowed to continue, it will undermine the very basis of society. It will undermine the legitimacy of governments. It will shake the foundations of democracy. Maybe it's not an existential threat, but if you have a problem which risks undermining the political order, which is already leading many different parts of the world to the rise of demagogues and people who are tapping into the resentments created by income inequality and saying to the voters, you vote for me, I will solve your problems, and this is happening in many countries already. We do have a problem. We do have a serious problem. One more example from the economic sphere. Until 2-3 months ago, I was working for the World Bank for many years. I was the director of one of the main research teams at the bank. And the World Bank is the organization that basically collects the data on poverty. It's the premier organization on poverty. It's part of its mandate to deal with the problem of poverty in the world. And so we have developed indicators, we have data, we have established poverty lines, and so we can speak on the issue of poverty with some level of authority. And the World Bank uses a definition of something that they call extreme poverty. Right, extreme poverty, and the definition of extreme poverty is in reference to something that is called a poverty line, and the poverty line for extreme poverty is $1.90 of income per person per day. Right, so if you earn less or up to $1.90 per day, you are considered extremely poor. And in 1990, there were something like 2 billion people in the world who were, according to this definition, extremely poor. Now just think of it, right? You wouldn't wish on your worst enemy to live on $1.90 per day. That translates into something like whatever, $700 of income per year, right? And it basically means that you live at the edge of survival, right? If you are a woman and your husband loses his job, then the next day your children won't have anything to eat. And you certainly don't make contributions to a pension scheme. You certainly don't have access to medical health. In many parts of the world, you don't even have access to basic sanitation, right? So in 1990, to have 2 billion people living on less than $1.90 per day, means that we have a serious poverty problem, right? Many of my colleagues in the World Bank will tell you, however, we have made great progress in reducing extreme poverty because today, in 2017, we only have about 760 million people that are characterized as extreme poverty. And that's progress. It's progress. It's more than half a drop in extreme poverty. Except that the story is actually a bit more nuanced than that. And I will say in particular 2 things. First, China accounts for a great deal of the reduction in extreme poverty from 2 billion to 760 million. China has been growing at double digits for the last many years, and they have pulled out of extreme poverty hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, right? So that's the first thing. More importantly, the number of poor in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the largest pocket of extremely poor people in the world, has actually risen, in a significant way. The poverty rate, that is in relation to population, for the last 30 years in Africa has remained essentially flat and very high, right? there is an economist in the United States, Nancy Birdsall. I have great respect for her. She's a very smart, enlightened sort of economist. And she makes the following point, and I am totally in agreement with her. Right? In fact, I have probably made this point by now more often than she has, because I think it's really so perceptive. But she says, forget about $1.90. It's too austere, right? If you shift the poverty line from $1.90 to $5.50, right, which still means an income of only about whatever $1,600 per year. Does anybody in Canada live on $1,600 per year? Nobody, right? But if you shift it to $5.50, and then what she does, which is very useful, is she paints a profile of a person living on $5.50 or less per day. And she calls people who have this kind of income strugglers. They struggle on a daily basis to make ends meet. They don't have enough money by the end of the month to pay all their bills. Poverty becomes not just an issue of low income, it also becomes an issue of stress and tension and suffering. People who live on this kind of level of income very often, one way in which they respond to that kind of a stress is by domestic violence, is by drug addiction, is by dropping out of school, and that sort of thing. So it's a social problem. Well, at that level of income, 48% of the world's population is poor, right? 48. One of every two human beings is poor, struggles, right? What's my point? My point is that although we have made progress in reducing extreme poverty according to the World Bank, we still have a huge problem of poverty in the world. Right? Let's not pretend otherwise. And of course, poverty in the world today, with the progress that we have made in the last several decades in the development of communications technologies, with access to social media, with people in Africa being able to perceive instantly what is the lifestyle of their peers in Sweden, in Denmark, in the United States, here in Canada, poverty is interacting with inequality in very toxic ways, right? You see, back in the 19th century, people in India were very poor, but they had no idea of how people lived in the UK, right? Today, we know exactly how people live in other parts of the planet, which is the reason why there are all these migratory pressures, why many people in Africa are basically deciding, no, the only way in which I'm going to be able to provide my children opportunities and sort of a better future is if I leave my country, Ghana, Burundi, Sierra Leone, and I actually move to Germany or Sweden, legally if I can, otherwise, if not, right? And so here we have yet another problem, right? So I don't want to go on with this list, but what is the point that I'm trying to make? Is that we have reached a point in human history where, for the first time, we are really facing, a multiplicity of problems, each of which, but certainly all of them combined, are putting our future at risk, and are raising questions about the sustainability of our economic and our political system. The last time that there was a concerted effort to re-examine our world order, to re-examine the system of institutions that we have, which provide the institutional context for managing global affairs, was in the early 1940s. What happened, I'll give you a little bit of the history, because this is very much linked to the concept of, the evolution of the concept of global governance. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, December the 7th to be precise. Within 3 weeks, Franklin Roosevelt invited Winston Churchill to come and spend Christmas and New Year's at the White House with him. And out of the consultations that they had emerged an initiative which was the creation of an organization, literally on January 1st of 1942, called the United Nations Organization. It was Franklin Roosevelt who himself coined that term. And what did it mean in practice on that day? He gathered together, I don't think physically, but in some other ways, communications. By then, of course, we had the telegraph and we had other ways of keeping in touch with the Allies. There were 21 nations that at that time were involved in the war effort against the Nazis, against the Axis powers, Italy, Japan, Germany. And these 21 nations came together and they signed a communique which basically made the following 3 points. Number one, we are not going to sign a separate peace with the Germans. We're going to stick together. We're going to work together. We're going to join forces and defeat it. And the second point, we're going to be ultimately victorious. That was an act of fate, essentially, because in early 1942, the war was going very, very badly for the Allies. I mean, the Germans were essentially, on a roll. And people were very, very much concerned about what that would imply for the future. Because people who had been pacifists in the First World War, like Bertrand Russell had actually gone to jail because he thought that the World War I was a complete unnecessary calamity. But by the time World War II came, Russell was making the point, no, this is a worth fighting, because I don't want to live under the Nazi ideology. I don't want to live in a regime that is motivated by this kind of odious ideology and view of the world and view of human race, right? So the Allies were very energized, and the third point of that communique was, after we defeat the Nazis and their allies, we will establish an international organization that will set a secure basis for peace, will set a permanent basis for peace and security, and therefore establish an institutional framework for social and economic development. That was the idea. All right, but that's just a statement of purpose, right? Literally, it's just one paragraph. But that's when the United Nations came into being. So what happened after that declaration of these 21 nations, which the Germans, of course, dismissed, well, let them do whatever they want. We are going to concentrate on the war effort, and we're going to dominate the world. We're going to take over the world. What happened, especially in 1942 and the early part of 1943, is that Roosevelt set up a kind of like a working group, experts, really top people, many of them at the State Department, but there were a few enlightened thinkers, academics, a couple of really, really progressive, very broad-minded journalists, and they all came together and they started thinking, so what is this United Organizations going to be? We need to give substance to this desire to set up this organization that will guarantee peace and security for the future. Right? Because Roosevelt and everybody around him felt we have to avoid this ever happening again. Right? This has to be the last war. Right? Which incidentally is what Wilson wanted to do with the League of Nations. Right? And so this group started working on this vision, how we're going to articulate and how we're going to shape this organization. And what I find particularly fascinating out of that period is how ambitious they were in the early stages of that debate. You know what they had in mind? They went back to the Constitutional Convention in the United States in 1787, which gave rise to the United States of America. And they say that is the model that we have to use for the United Nations. Right? Now, what was achieved in 1787 in the United States? It was essentially the creation of a new level of governance, which is called the federal government, that, for instance, would have the monopoly on the use of power. Right? The colonies that signed the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787 abdicated permanently the right to make war. They gave it to a higher level of government called the federal government. And not just the right to make war, they abdicated other powers as well. From then on, the states could no longer print their own money. The federal government was given the authority to regulate the money supply, to issue bonds to finance the expenditures, to regulate interstate commerce between the colonies and so on. Right? So what was done in 1787 in the United States was really, truly imaginative. In fact, it was the beginning for the United States of the rise of the country that eventually culminated in its emergence as the most powerful economic and military power in the world. Because the moment that the colonies abdicated those powers to the federal government, you establish a framework for peace and stability. Right? Then the colonies gave up the power to war with each other, and that power was given to the federal government. Yes, of course, later in the 19th century we had the Civil War, but that's another set of issues which it was temporary, it lasted a few years, it did not in any way undermine the power of the federal government. I am one who, as an economist, thinks that the emergence of the United States as a global economic power is directly linked to what was done in Philadelphia in 1787. The fact that the creation of the federal government created a context for the nations to then focus not on warfare, not on fighting with each other, not on nationalisms as Texas nationalism or some of the other colonies, but basically we're going to now focus on progress, on social and economic development. We're going to build a basis for prosperity, as was put by one president many years later to highlight the kind of America that emerged out of that convention. He said, "The business of America is business." Right? What does that mean? It means it's not war. It's growing rich and being stable and being prosperous and giving opportunity to our children and investing in science and technology, right? That is the business of America. Right? All right. So that was what people were thinking would be the United Nations, right? We are going to create a world legislature that is going to have a member countries, and this legislature is going to be given the authority to pass laws which are going to be binding on its members, just as the laws of the federal government in the coming out of 1787 would be binding on the member states of the United States of America, right? Now, that was the dream, that was the vision. What happened is that, as often happens in life, the visions sometimes have to confront reality. And in October of 1943, there was a conference in Moscow. Roosevelt went, Churchill went, a few other heads of state. The Chinese were there as well. Although this was not communist China. This was China before the communist takeover, which came many years later. And at that time, the Chinese were largely siding with the Americans, and they were not really a kind of an independent voice at the conference. But they were there because it's a very populous country. And in Moscow, Stalin, well, the reason they went to Moscow is because Roosevelt wanted the United Nations to be a truly global organization, number one. Number two, Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, was an ally in the war effort against Nazi Germany, correct? All right, so they needed to be brought in. They needed to be part of articulating the vision of what the United Nations is going to be like. So they went to Moscow, and in Moscow, Stalin basically said, my priority today is not the creation of a United Nations after the war, because we're not there yet. My priority today is to defeat the Nazis. And for that, I want you, the allies, you Roosevelt, you Churchill, I want you to open a front on the Western side against the Nazis. So I will attack them from the east, you will attack them from the west, and we will jointly defeat them. And if after the war you want me to sign something called the United Nations, I'm happy to do it. You just show me the paper, show me where to sign, provided that this organization is never going to tell me what to do, and is never going to take away any of my prerogatives as a sovereign state. That was a bath of cold water, as they say, right? Because that went directly against that ambitious vision of the early period, right? But then, of course, Roosevelt himself, by the way, that's how the power of the veto came into being, right? That it was the price that had to be paid in order to get Stalin to endorse the United Nations and to join as a member, right? But then Roosevelt had his own domestic problems back at home, right? Because what had happened to President Wilson 20 years before with the League of Nations, right? Wilson had, in fact, thought during the time of World War I of creating very much like a United Nations. He wanted World War I to be the last war ever. In the book, we have some very, very touching quotes of some of the speeches that Wilson gave as he traveled around the United States trying to get the public, people in Arizona, in California, and other parts of the United States, to write to their senators to tell them to endorse the League of Nations. Because see, the League of Nations was an international. The League of Nations covenant, the piece of paper that set out the organization, was an international treaty. And in the U.S. Constitution, to get an international treaty approved, you need 2/3 majority of the Senate. So he needed to have literally 60-some senators to endorse the League of Nations, and that was a tall order, because there were some senators that were not particularly interested in multilateralism, who basically were not wedded to the idea of the United States joining a global organization that it itself would not necessarily control completely and totally, right? And so Wilson traveled all over the United States, and some of the speeches that he gave are really so moving. I have great admiration for him. One of the thoughts that in particular I found very, very, very special is he's really being very honest in one of the speeches that he gave, I think in Arizona. And he says, you can't imagine the burden that I feel every day of my life when I realize that I have sent thousands and thousands of young Americans to fight in Europe, and I know that many of them will not come back, right? And this is obvious because he's getting reports of hundreds of casualties every day. And he says, I feel this burden that we need to do something to prevent this from ever happening again. I don't want my successors, any future presidents in the United States, to ever find themselves under the condition of having to send young people to their deaths again, right? So he was greatly motivated. But you know the story. In the end, he failed. The senators did not approve the League, and the League of Nations was born without the participation of the most powerful military and economic actor in the world. And many students of history have said that was very much one of the factors in its ultimate failure. So Roosevelt, to come back to the 1940s, does not want to go the way of Wilson. He does not want to create this organization, which then is voted down in the Senate, right? And so what then happens? What then happens is a kind of a watering down of that ambitious vision. By then, there was, of course, a draft United Nations Charter, a document, right? Just like there had been a draft covenant at the time of the League of Nations that was being debated, was being discussed, was being sort of consulted by the members. And so what then began is a process of watering down the UN Charter to the point where the American government, his administration, could feel confident enough that if they put this to the Senate, it would not be defeated but like the League of Nations was defeated, right? And so essentially, that's exactly what they did. In the days and the months leading to the San Francisco Conference in 1945, basically, the question was no longer what kind of a United Nations do we need in order to create peace and security, which was the right question to begin with. The question was, what kind of a UN Charter will make it past the US Senate, right? Where we have many senators who have never traveled outside the United States and whose only vision of a world is one in which the United States can keep for itself all its prerogatives and all its power, right? And so that, in a sense, was what happened. It's interesting, you learn these things only when you get into the history, when the moment came to actually take the document to the US Senate for a vote, the US administration would make the argument that we are creating an organization that is so weak and is going to be so ineffective that we, as a sovereign nation, are never going to be in any way affected by any of its decisions. We will continue to run the world, essentially, that was the message. And therefore, the UN Charter was approved by the US Senate without reservations, 89-2, that was the vote, 89-2, right? And that overwhelming vote was partly linked to the idea that, look, sign here because nothing will happen, right? Which now, this is, the vote was taken in July of 1945, 89-2, it's very, very telling, right? Now, of course, the United States is an open society, there is freedom of the press, and there were very prominent thinkers, who were already raising the alarm bells. One of them was Grenville Clark. Grenville Clark is a towering figure of 20th century America, a public servant who, because he had independent means, never earned $1 of salary from the US government, but he always worked pro bono. But because he had been a classmate of Roosevelt at Harvard University, they graduated on the same year from the same law group, and then they went to work for the same Wall Street firm in New York. They were very, very close. So when Roosevelt became president, he relied on Clark for multiple kinds of projects and drafting pieces of legislation and so on. And so Clark, he understood perfectly well what was happening, and he raised the alarms. In 1940, I'm trying to remember, 1944, as the debate on the UN Charter was going on, in many different parts of the world among the potential UN members, he was saying, no, you can't go this way. You are going to create an organization that is going to be called upon to do wonderful things, but will not be able to deliver any of those things. All these noble principles outlined in the preamble of the UN Charter, are going to be just dead letter, because you are not giving it the instruments that will empower it, to deliver on those promises. And that's exactly what happened. So, and Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, all of them were very active in this public debate, warning and saying, no, this is not the way we want to go. But that's another story. The UN Charter was adopted with the veto power and other flaws in 1945 at a conference in San Francisco. Grenville Clark, teamed up with a law professor by the name of Louis Son, and in 1958, a bit more than a decade after the end of World War II, they came up with a set of proposals. It was called World Peace Through World Law. It's actually a very, very significant contribution to the kind of United Nations that we would like to have, to actually empower it, to do the things that it has not been able to do. But by the 1950s, there was no interest on the subject. By the 1950s, we were in the middle of the Cold War. By the 1950s, the Soviets had already developed nuclear weapons. And what was actually happening in the world, it was an arms race. And so when Clark went around all over the world, because he was a man of means, because he was a highly regarded intellectual, a very, very prominent public figure, highly respected all over the world. So he had no problem, going to London and presenting a copy of his book to the Prime Minister. He went to India and presented a copy of the book to Nehru, and so on. People they praised the work. They liked it. They thought, this is a very noble framework. But there was no interest, and nothing ever came out of that work. Not one of the suggestions and proposals that Clark and Son, his partner in the project, put forward on world peace through world law ever came into being. We think, by we I mean, my two co-authors and myself, but we're certainly part of a growing group of researchers and thinkers who basically think this way. We think that the time has come for us to go back to that original vision, either of as articulated in the early years, 1942 and 1943, or more substantially in the work that was done by Clark and by Son. We think that the time has come for us to go back and to rethink and to ask ourselves once again, what kind of a system of global governance do we want to have in place to deal with the risks that today cast a shadow over our future? Just as the motivation for the creation of the United Nations in the early 1940s was the war that was taking place around, right? You just place yourself in the history of the moment, right? Hundreds of thousands of people are being killed on a monthly basis. Eventually, the toll for World War II was 60 million dead, right? So do you find it difficult to understand that people like Churchill and Roosevelt might feel energized, motivated to actually begin and raising the questions? We need to move to a different kind of world where this is not going to ever happen again. So we are now in 2020. I have mentioned to you a handful of the risks that we are facing as a human family, right? So do you find it sort of surprising that some of us are arguing, no, we need to rethink the kind of global governance system that we have in place, because otherwise we're going to be overwhelmed by these risks, right? Not at all. I think it's a very sensible proposition. Now, so you may not think that we are off in terms of the motivation and putting forward that idea, right? But some people would say, what gives you the confidence that today you're going to have any more success than Grenville Clark and Louis Sohn had in 1958 when they published the World Peace Through War Law, and they went around the world arguing for revamping the UN system, right? That's a legitimate question. Yeah? If they failed, why are you not going to fail yourself, right? And that is a question which requires an answer. And it is an answer that we give in great detail in the book, but the elements of which I will give you in the next 3 minutes. And there are 4 arguments that we're making as to why the time is ripe now in a way that was not the case in 1940s and 1950s. First, we argue that the current system has few defenders. There are no people with any kind of intellectual credibility that are going around the world and saying, don't worry, we can muddle through for the next 50 years. There are no people who are making that argument. So that's one idea, right? All of these issues that I have referred to, from climate change to inequality to poverty to nuclear proliferation, they are very important risks that we face as a human family, and the current system is not delivering solutions. It really is not. On the climate change side, you might say, well, but there is the Paris Agreement on climate change. But the scientists, even the scientists who applauded, who were present there, Al Gore, who was there standing up and celebrating the signing of the agreement, they already were saying afterwards, you know, this is a first step. And that's why they were standing up and applauding. It's a first step. We're recognizing that we have a problem which we need to confront. But the commitments made by the countries are completely voluntary. They are non-binding. And there are no penalties if you don't fulfill your commitments. But what more importantly, if everybody does everything that they have committed to do, it won't prevent a rise in temperature of in excess of 2 degrees. So it doesn't really solve the problem. So it's very good public relations, and you could say it's even more than that. It's an acceptance that we have a problem, but we don't have a mechanism that is going to deliver solutions, right? So therefore, muddling through is not going to work. So that's the first thing. Second argument is that, and then I think you will find this argument persuasive because we see it every day, is that the world is integrated today in a way that wasn't the case in the 1950s. How many times more integrated? I would say 1,000 times more integrated than we were in the 1950s and 1960s. This has been led by technology. It has been led by rapid reductions in the cost of transport and communication, and it's part of the process of globalization. Let me give you one dramatic example of it, again from an economic perspective. In 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, and we were in the middle of a global financial crisis, maybe not yet. We were in the middle of a very serious financial crisis in the United States. The finance ministers or senior economic authorities of some of the countries, like in India and in Russia and in Brazil and some of the big so-called emerging markets, they were making the following argument. They were saying, what is the cause of the crisis in the United States? And the answer to that question at that moment was, well, the cause is exposure of the big American banks to so-called toxic assets, right? These subprime mortgages and so on. And so the prime minister of one of these countries would ask the finance minister, are we exposed to those toxic assets the way the American banks are exposed? And the answer would be, no, not at all. Our banks are completely clean. They, our bankers were not crazy enough to buy this assets, right? And so there was a feeling of comfort and say, well, then this crisis is going to be, very much focused on the big markets, the advanced economies. It will affect the UK, Europe, the United States. Well, how wrong that was. Within 6 months, this crisis had become a complete global catastrophe, because all of a sudden we realized that, we have a global economy, right? If companies in Brazil they may not be exposed to these toxic assets, but you know what? They basically require access to credit markets all over the world. They depend on foreign investment coming in from the rich countries. If these things dry up completely, that crisis is a crisis here, right? And that's exactly what happened. Something that began in the United States immediately became a systemic shock and was deeply destabilizing. Not only that, the irony was that the worst affected countries were not the United States and England and some of the other countries. The worst affected countries were the countries that depended on finance from the rich economies, right? So a war between two nuclear-armed nations today is infinitely more destructive and destabilizing of the social and political order than a war would have been in the pre-1945 period when we didn't have access to nuclear weapons, right? So that's the second factor. It's the fact that we live in a landscape, in a world that is dramatically different than the world that we had in the 1950s and the 1960s. Third factor. What has happened in the last several decades is a dramatic shift of power away from governments towards civil society and the business community. This has been much commented about by leading social and political scientists. The emergence of civil society organizations, NGOs, and so on, as a very important player in decision making. Let me give you a few examples. When scientists get together and they say, what are the 3 or 4 most important initiatives of international cooperation over the last 20 years? They will say, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change is very important. The 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has been endorsed by more than 120 countries by now. The creation of International Criminal Court in the early part of the millennium as well. Those are 3 examples. There are a couple more, right? What is characteristic of all these initiatives? They were all began by civil society organizations. They were not government-inspired or government-sponsored initiatives. Governments came in later on. Once civil society organizations had actually drafted a treaty called the Treaty on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, then what they did is they approached the Norwegians, they approached the Mexicans, they approached the New Zealanders at the United Nations, and they say, look, we have this treaty, we think that this would be in the interest of humanity, why don't you take it over, and then you lobby other governments to join you and sign this treaty, right? And so that has become the new way in which we innovate now. It is no longer governments taking the initiative and saying, we will do this for the good of the planet. It's actually civil society, the business community, telling governments, we must do this for the good of the planet, right? And that power shift has been very notable. And then finally, of course, because of science and technology, communications, we live in a world in which it is much easier to engage people, much more easy to mobilize public opinion, and as a result of that, and on top of that, more and more people are very much aware of the risks that we have today, and want to do something about it. And so these 4 things, collectively give us hope that we are now entering a phase where governments, the business community, other stakeholders would be willing to consider these proposals in a way that was not the case in the 1950s and 60s, right? And my expectation is that as some of these forces, especially climate change, begin to hit us with greater force in coming years, it will sensitize governments and other stakeholders, to the kinds of proposals that we're putting forward. One of the problems that you have with the current United Nations is that we have a General Assembly that was founded on the principle of one country, one vote, right? And the UN has 193 member countries, and that essentially means that the voting power of China, with a population of 1.4 billion people, is the same as the voting power of, let's say, Nauru, which is a small island in the Pacific with a population of 13,000 people, right? But what has happened is that as a result of that principle of one country, one vote, you have all kinds of distortions within the General Assembly, and you have a sense of lack of ownership of that particular UN agency on the part of the larger member countries, right? Because essentially what can happen is that a group of developing countries, which perhaps among themselves account for 0.5% of the budget of the United Nations, they can essentially block the decisions of much larger countries, which are essentially bearing the full cost of running the organization, or much of the cost of running the organization. So Clark already alluded to this problem, but what we have done is we have taken over his proposals and we have modernized them. When he made the proposals, the United Nations had 60 member countries. Today we have 193 member countries. And so what we're saying is that no, we should move to a system where the voting power of each nation is linked in some way to some objective criteria, such as, for instance, population size, the size of the economy, and what we call a membership share, which is the same for all countries. And the idea of this membership share is to prevent a situation where the General Assembly voting structure is unduly dominated by countries with very large population, which is exactly the opposite problem that we have today. Right? The shares still add up to 100%, but whereas now each share is 1 divided by 193, now we have a much more rational system of voting power where China, the United States, and some of the bigger countries have more of a say. And we think that if you do this, then it gives legitimacy to that body. It gives it a level of authority and credibility that it doesn't have today because of this very warped voting mechanism. In fact, Clark argued, he said that this is deliberate. The founders of the United Nations are using this principle of one country, one vote, essentially to render the General Assembly completely useless, right? And to give all the power to the Security Council where the big nations have the veto power, right? And so it was kind of Clark was arguing this was cynically done, to basically allow countries like the Soviet Union and the United States essentially keep control of the United Nations. And then the General Assembly just becomes like a debating chamber that has no implications for the actual peace and security mandate of the UN. Second idea is that for quite some time already, many experts have been saying one of the problems with the United Nations is that it has no democratic legitimacy. Right? Who gets to serve on the General Assembly, which is the equivalent of the legislative body, right? Not only does it have this silly principle of one country, one vote, but the people who serve on it are who? They're diplomats. They're people who represent their governments back at home, right? They're bureaucrats in some sense. If the governments back at home are democratic, then you could say that in some sense, those particular representatives have some degree of democratic legitimacy. But if they're not, if there are countries that basically have authoritarian regimes where there are no elections, then those people who serve on the on the General Assembly have no connection with the people, right? And yet the UN Charter begins by saying, "We the peoples." Those are the first 3 words of the UN Charter, right? It's a statement of we, the members of the human family, think that, right? And then it goes on to lay out the principles. And so people have been arguing, this is a flaw. We need to strengthen the democratic legitimacy of the United Nations, and there are a number of ideas that have been put forward. And one way to do that is to create a second chamber attached to the General Assembly, which by now in the terminology is called the World Parliamentary Assembly. Right? And this second chamber, which in the book we argue would have initially largely an advisory role, would be made up initially of parliamentarians for the member countries, and then gradually over time you could shift it to a period where they could be directly elected in their individual countries, right? And so these people, because they would be elected ultimately by their voters and their individual members, would have this connection with the people, right? And so it would bring a degree of legitimacy to the United Nations as an organization, and we think that it would strengthen the kind of debate that could place within the context of the UN, especially on global issues of concern to everybody. In 2000, and this is an interesting development. In 2000, the Secretary General of the United Nations invited 1,400 NGOs to come to New York in May to discuss among themselves, what are the problems that we face as a human family? Can you debate over a period of a couple of weeks, on environment, human rights, income inequality, gender issues? So the agenda is open. But most importantly, because in September there will be the largest gathering ever of heads of state, right? It was called the Millennium Summit, appropriately. It's the year 2000. So the Secretary General told the representatives of these 1,400 organizations, you synthesize the sense of your consultations, and you come in September to the Millennium Summit, and you deliver your conclusions to the heads of state. We argue in the book that it would actually be a wonderful idea to make this a formal mechanism of consultation, right? Rather than being it a one-off every 1,000 years, right? We do it like every few years, and that because these civil society organizations are not coming wearing their French or Chinese or Indian hats, but they're coming wearing their hat for human rights, for gender equality, for better environmental stewardship, right? That they would bring into the debating chamber a degree of identification with social problems that goes simply beyond those things that are strictly defined in terms of the national interest, right? Because you see, when the representative of France goes and debates at the General Assembly, he's a French citizen above everything else, right? He's there to defend the interest of his country, right? Whereas the NGO Forum brought a whole new level of engagement with global problems which affect all of humanity. We argue in the book that this should be made a permanent feature of the UN system, and that you can give this NGO Forum kind of an advisory role again, to the Security Council, to the General Assembly. One of the issues that was hotly debated at the time that the UN was being sort of shaped, put into place, was the whole question of collective security, right? The idea of, can we develop a mechanism that would actually allow the institution to deal effectively with the problem of war and violence and interstate conflict? And they drafted an article, is Article 43 of the UN Charter. The UN Charter is actually a very short document. There's a pocket version of it, which is this thin. It only has about 100 articles. Some of the articles, 109, 110, I can't remember exactly the number, but some of them are very short, right? But there is a very important article, Article 43, and I just want to read the core of it. It says the following: all members of the United Nations, in order to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, which is the reason why the organization was created, right? Undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security, right? So Article 43 essentially envisaged the emergence of some kind of international peace force, right? Some kind of international army, right? That would be made up of contributions from the member countries. And it's fascinating to see the debate. When the Americans were debating among ourselves, what is going to be our contribution to this force, right? Which is going to be which was going to be available to the Security Council. The numbers that they were working with, I mean, this comes out of minutes of meetings that they had, and the numbers that they were working with were 300,000 soldiers, more than 2,000 aircraft, and of course all the other weapons and systems and material that goes around, goes associated with a force of this nature. This is what they were contributing. This is what they thought would be the American contribution to this force, right? And in fact, this article is dead letter. It has never been implemented. It has never been implemented. But it's there. The legal basis is already there, for the setting up of this force, right? So we're saying, let's go back to Article 43, and since the legal basis has already been established there, let's act on it. The use of force in the interest of justice is already an established principle of the UN Charter. It's something that we have accepted. The UN Charter is not a pacifist document. The UN Charter says you can use force, And that principle actually has been reinforced in multiple ways over the years as a principle. There is something called responsibility to protect, which was developed some 15 years ago, which strengthens even the sense of this article, right? the time has come for us to basically do that, to create an international peace force. Right? This international peace force would be a UN force. It would be recruited internationally. The soldiers would not owe their loyalty, as the peacekeepers do, to their respective countries. They would owe their loyalty to the United Nations. They would be paid by the United Nations. The command structure would be a UN command structure. And it would be funded by the members, of course. And the idea essentially is to create a context where you remove the incentives for nations to do what they do today, which is 193 member countries. Everybody wants to have the army. Everybody wants to have a navy, an air force. We overspend in defense and in security because every nation feels that they have to do this because they are in charge of their own security. We don't have a system that provides security to everybody, through some kind of international cooperation. And not only would we end up spending a lot less on defense, which we do to the tune of $2 trillion every year, and more as well. That's $2 trillion that are identified in the budgets of countries, but in fact there's a great deal more going on the defense side, which is off budget. But more importantly, it would allow us to redirect resources from propping up our military establishments to things like education and training and public health and infrastructure. The kinds of things that ultimately have an impact on productivity and competitiveness, on enhancing the quality of life for communities. Right? I come from Latin America, and in Latin America we spend every year $65 billion on defense. When was the last time that two Latin American nations had a war among each other? It was in the 1930s, more than 80 years ago. It was the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay, which was lethal and destructive and sort of took away a good chunk of the male population of both countries. Right? But that was the last time. Right? I ask you, when a nation in Latin America modernizes its air force at a cost of a couple of $1 billion, what is the opportunity cost of that expenditure? What does a nation actually get out of modernizing its air force in Latin America in the context of a continent that hasn't seen a war between two nations in the last virtually 100 years? Nothing. Nothing. There is no economic return whatsoever. These military aircraft, number one, they're very expensive. Number two, it isn't just a one-time expenditure. You have to sign maintenance contracts. These machines are very sophisticated. They go wrong you practically have a team of mechanics or the manufacturers living in your country on a permanent basis. They are usually bought by debts, which then have to be serviced at high interest, for the foreseeable future, right? So what are these machines actually used for? You tell me. Tell me. Well, I'll tell you, all right? Once a year, on National Independence Day, the pilots get on these machines and they fly over the Capitol and they impress the population, because they're very loud, they're very fast. And that's about the end of it, right? Have they been used in the last 80 years, for actual defense? Not at all, not at all. Maybe you could say they're there as a deterrent, right? As a deterrent, but we don't have particular conflicts in the region. Our nations are actually largely at peace with each other. In fact, we have more commerce. When I was a young boy, you used to get a visa to go to Argentina, to go to Chile. Today, you can just go with your ID. You don't need a passport to enter these countries anymore, right? So the whole context is one of greater cooperation, lowering of barriers, and making war with each other is really not a high priority, right? So spending these $65 billion per year over a decade translates into more than $500 billion. Now, I know that in the United States, $500 billion is not very much, but in countries that still have high levels of poverty, many social problems, a lot of inequality, very poor public health infrastructure, very poor physical infrastructure, $500 billion per decade is a huge amount of money, right? And so our idea is also motivated in terms of the economics, the idea that by releasing resources which are currently dedicated to security and defense, we move to a world where we can spend more on those things that really matter, right? And I think you will agree with me that that is education. It is having better hospitals, giving more opportunities to our children, and so on and so forth, right? If we don't do this, if we basically continue to live in a world of largely inertia, right? right? Very much focused on, tomorrow's crisis, the stock market collapsed, in the past week. So how do we deal with the consequences of that immediate problem, in the next week, and so on. Then these risks that I have identified, will continue to manifest themselves in multiple ways, and we certainly want to avoid a scenario where we begin to rethink about our global governance system after a crisis that has caused great deal of disruption and suffering to the human family. Right? Rather, we're arguing is no, we should be engaged in that debate now before the crisis happens, or the crisis in the plural happen, and they overwhelm human institutions and they overwhelm us. Right? It is much better to do so now than to do after the crisis, because then the opportunities are more limited. If climate change accelerates in a big way, and as a result of that, we have huge flows of migration. We have hundreds of millions of people who become environmental refugees. Fruit production is affected in a big way because of the impact of climate change especially on developing countries, which are heavily dependent on agriculture, and on and on and on. Just imagine, all the collateral effects, To be thinking about how to set up a basis for peace and security and stability and prosperity in the context of that crisis is much more difficult and much more costly than to do it now, when we still have, things under relative control. But ultimately, the reason we want to move in that direction is because we want to leave a world to our children that is one in which they will have the capacity to develop their to develop their talents, to focus on the kinds of things that will improve, the quality of life for the community, not to deliver to our children a world in which basically they will have to be confronting, the consequences of these kinds of risks and catastrophes as they manifest themselves, right? So in a sense, that is really the motivation, It is our children and the children of our children, because they are the ones who will bear the cost of inaction, right? Thank you so much. I spoke for too long.